My name is Mike. I'm with Seatech Marine Products and Daily Watermakers. I'm joined here today with Mike from Spectra. We're going to be at the boat show, San Diego International Boat Show, this June 11th to 14th. I think that having Mike here with us today would be a great opportunity to basically answer general and common questions that we get all the time. This is for the people who are cruising, living aboard, going down to Mexico. So, Mike, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Mike. Looking forward to it.
If you don't mind introducing yourself and telling us how you got started with Spectra, that would be great.
Sure. My name is Mike Schmidt, and I'm the director for Spectra Watermakers. I've been working with Spectra's parent company, Catadyn, for about 25 years. And a couple years ago, they approached me and asked me to consider spending more time on the Watermaker division, and here I am.
Okay, how are you liking it so far in the boating world?
I really like it a lot. Spectra, as you might know, is a 30-year-old brand in the US, which is
Yep.
pretty rare air. Only about 1% of US brands ever make it to 30 years. And really, Spectra was one of the pioneers of the modern blue water cruising desalination market. We were one of the first brands to come up with an energy recapture system, which dramatically lowered the amount of energy that was needed on board. And we are currently the number one brand and the most widely recognized brand by US consumers in the boating market.
Let's go back one second. Let's explain to maybe someone who's a little bit newer exactly what a water maker is, specifically for boaters.
Yeah, so a water maker system, although it's one of your most necessary systems on board, it oftentimes is also one of the least understood or least interfaced with. But it's really pretty simple. You need salt water. And you need pressure, which is typically generated by pumps. And then you need to force that water through a membrane of the appropriate size aperture that allows essentially the molecules of hydrogen and oxygen to pass through while capturing the sodium and discharging that overboard in the form of like a brine discharge.
So basically, take seawater and convert it into fresh water, right?
That's exactly right.
And then, so you're saying that Spectra's has a certain type of pump for energy efficiency. Is that what really sets Spectra apart from the other water maker companies? Can you give us a little brief overview of how that pump works?
Sure. Yeah. So I think what you're talking about is the Clark pump. And Spectra, as I mentioned, was founded in 1997. And not long after its founding, a commercial fisherman and inventor by the name of Clark Permore approached us, and he had come up with a pump that recaptured the energy to push the water through the membrane. So one way you could force the seawater through the membrane is through with big high energy consumption electric pumps. But they tend to take a lot of energy and they tend to make a lot of noise. And what Clark did was he came up with a patented, unique idea for a pump that took a lower boost pressure, but recycled the energy, if you will, recaptured 75% of the energy that was used to create the initial boost. And that amplified the overall pressure to where we needed it to be to force that seawater through the membrane and extract the sodium.
The Clark pump is very unique. It's also very quiet compared to the your traditional AC pump, much quieter. Now, we were talking about energy efficiency with the Clark pump, and that's basically the main selling point in my eyes for Spectra, plenty of other selling points. For boaters, why is energy efficiency so important, and what type of boaters is that geared towards?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it's kind of intuitive in the blue water sailing battery bank market. I think that group of customers has always had an energy budget consciousness, if you will. They know they're going to be traveling far from home. They know they're going to be relying on stored energy. So, blue water sailors of the past, 5 decades have understood that they needed to ration power. But even today, on your modern powerboat, systems are becoming so complex, and we have so many different options in terms of onboard systems. We're now adding things like Seakeepers for stabilization, Starlink for connectivity, DockMate for, ease of use. That really energy
Mhm.
consumption is a feature that everybody should look at. You also pointed out the quietness of the Clark pump, which is absolutely correct. When it's in operation, it's barely much louder than a metronome. It's kind of
Yeah.
just clicking back and forth on every cycle. And a lot of times, you're going to make water all hours of the day. So, and you may have that pump mounted close to where you're living, which I'm sure we're going to talk about in a little bit. But having, a low decibel rating, a high energy recapture, those are all things that make the system, really user friendly and reliable on board.
So let's get into talking about, first time buyers, people who are just getting into the market for water makers. Let's say we have someone who says they think they need a water maker. They're the boat owner, they're just getting started. What kind of qualification questions should we be asking them?
So generally, when I meet folks for the first time and they're water maker curious, some of the things that I like to talk about and understand really is the vessel. What size boat are we talking about?
Mm-hmm.
What size water tank do you have on board? But then it's equally as important to understand the crew and the lifestyle of the
Mm-hmm.
individual owner. So how many people are you going to have on board? Where do you want to go in your cruising adventure? Do you want to
Yep.
go north? Do you want to go south? And that can play a little bit of a role in your ultimate choice. But then really also lifestyle. I mean, there are customers, within our family that have been living aboard their boat for a decade and are on their second circumnavigation of the globe, right? And those folks tend to fall into more of a blue water cruising lifestyle, where, maybe they're not taking freshwater showers every day and they're not washing their clothes like they would at home. And so those folks tend to be a little bit more rugged in terms of a low water consumption,
Mm-hmm.
but if you're like so many of us that are only going to get out for extended cruises over the holidays or during
Right.
vacation time, you may also want to incorporate, aspects of your normal at-home lifestyle, things like, washing the dishes, not in salt water, if you could imagine, and or your clothes. So the closer you want to be to your on-land lifestyle, the more water you're going to consume on a daily basis. And a really good general rule of thumb is, when you're in your home every day, not thinking about water, just turning on the spigot, you are probably consuming in the neighborhood of 10 gallons per day per person. And so, depending on how camp you want to be versus how much at home you want to be while on board your
Right.
vessel, you kind of want to tune to that baseline.
You mentioned basically asking about their lifestyle, what they're doing for boating, what their boat is. We're thinking about how big their freshwater tanks are, what their capacity is, right? Okay, when we're accurately sizing a water maker for a boat owner, how should the boat owner think about sizing a water maker? Water makers, they come in descriptions of gallons per day, right? So,
Mhm.
what does that actually mean when we're sizing it for a customer? Do you think that we should size it in terms of like gallons per hour and maybe gallons per day is for the rare few? Or do you think, you know what I mean? Should we size it larger so they use the water maker less? What is your opinion and what is Spectra's like take on that?
This is a great question, and I really like it. You're right. And I think this probably stems back to 30 years ago when the water maker industry was really getting started at the recreational level. The benchmark was gallons produced per day. But I
Right,
think you hit the nail right on the head. A far better descriptor, and or criteria should be gallons per hour
right,
because you're in all likelihood not going to be running the water maker for 24 hours a day. And another element to consider here is while you certainly could make water in select anchorages, the best place to make water is while you are out in open fresh water. The more brackish the water, the more turbidity that is in the water, like you might find in a marina or in a harbor, the
hmm,
quicker that the pre-filters are going to be clogged. So if you had your druthers, the best environment for making fresh water out of salt water is when you're offshore cruising. And so an extension of that quite naturally is, well, how many hours a day are you going to be offshore cruising? So I
hmm.
like to think about, a 3 to 5 hour window, and then how many gallons an hour are you going to make? So if you go back to my original equation of kind of a high watermark of being 10 gallons a day, if you have four people on board your sailboat and your water maker makes 14, 15 gallons an hour, if you can run that water maker 3 or 4 hours a day, you probably have ample water to top off your tanks, and still do a load of laundry once a week once the clothes have gotten salt drenched, right? And wash down the boat at the end of the day. And we can talk a little bit more about that later.
I think that's a really good point. I love that you're talking about whether you're making water at the docks or underway, and how much time you have for either one and what that means in terms of maintenance for your water makers. I think that's a very important thing to think about. And, if you're at home trying to figure out which water maker to purchase or what you want to like focus on, those are some great ideas and things to think about. Absolutely. How many people are you going to have on board, right? And what you mentioned before, do they want to do more of a camp style or they want to be filled more at home? Okay, Mike. So we've talked about how to choose your water maker, or at least how to get started. What are the prerequisites to figuring out what you need? What are some common mistakes that people make when sizing a water maker?
Yeah, this is a good one too. And we just kind of touched upon this a moment
Right.
ago, but really one of the things that I see far too often is people want to go to the smallest unit possible.
Mm-hmm.
We make some survival type systems, which would be backup systems. And it's remarkable how on almost a weekly basis, I get a lot of solo sailors that think that they could really even get by on an emergency water maker. So that's a big mistake for the reasons that we mentioned. So definitely some of the most common mistakes that we see are folks that they size too small to begin with. And then they figure out down the line that additional capacity would be much more convenient. And I should point out that you're not exponentially going to go up in price. The base systems are pretty comparable. So when
Mm-hmm.
you think about a 5 gallon an hour system versus a 15 gallon an hour system, you're not tripling the price, right? So you
Right.
really do want to think about that. I always tell people, try to think about what you're going to be doing on average. There might be some times when you're sailing alone. There might be some times when you have six people on board, but really think about what you're going to be doing on average and then size appropriately. So I think that that's one big mistake that people make. I should also point out that a well-maintained system should last you 20 years too. So it's not an area to necessarily skimp on, dissimilar to, let's say, navigation systems, which I seem to replace on my boat about every 5 years. The water maker should last you several decades if it's well maintained and taken care of.
Right.
So don't go too small out of the gates. And then secondly, be thoughtful about that installation. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about installation in a minute, but thinking about where it's going to be, how accessible it's going to be for maintenance, those are all things in the planning stage that'll really pay dividends for you down the line when you're in an anchorage somewhere trying to get access to the system.
Yeah, that's a good point. I wanted to point out real quickly or give a little story about sizing and going too small. And I think sizing and going too small, basically, from what I've noticed, it has a lot to do with budget, right? And you
Sure.
want to get as close to your budget or even under your budget, and I don't think a water maker is something that you you should think about trying to go under your budget, right? You should
Sure.
you should like Mike said, you should definitely try to size up more than what you're thinking of getting at the lowest, right? We want to think of the average, what not when you're just by yourself, but your average use. I totally agree with that. And the reason why I mentioned that is let's see, probably 13, 14 years ago when I first started selling Spectra Watermakers, I just wanted to get the customer exactly what they wanted for their budget and not really try to help them, really think through exactly what they needed. And I learned that lesson not really the hard way, but when I was at Spectra Watermakers in California for service seminar, right? You guys host that sometimes where you guys teach people how to service their water makers. And I was there and I met a customer who wasn't the happiest that I sold him the smallest possible unit. And yeah, I learned my lesson. I learned my lesson. We need to absolutely have a conversation about what is your average use and what unit really fits into that. And I think it's very important to keep that in mind when you're looking at all the water makers, the 150 gallons per day, 200 gallons per day. Realistically, like we mentioned before, that is you're running it only for a few hours. So we really need to think about the sizing. It's not something to skimp on like you mentioned. I think it's very important to invest in something that gives you fresh water, which is vital, right?
Sure.
To make sure you're choosing the right one for your application.
I couldn't agree more with that. And if I could just expand on that a little bit, the other
Yeah.
thing too that's kind of new in the last 10 years is water scarcity all over the world. So we're going to be at the San Diego Boat Show. San
Hmm.
Diego is one of the first U.S. municipalities to bring on a large-scale municipal desalination plant. But all across the world, desalination more and more is how people are getting their water.
Yeah.
Right now in the Bahamas, water at the dock will cost you 6.25 a gallon.
Wow.
And depending on where you're at in the world, if there was any level of a natural disaster, whether that's a tropical depression that knocks out the municipal system or any number of things that can happen, water scarcity is real. And water is a first need. We can live 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food. And so when you think about all of the emergency equipment and all the stuff that you have on board your vessel to improve your cruising experience, water is one of the things that oftentimes is overlooked because it just lives in this big tank that we don't need to think about. But it really does pay dividends to invest in that water maker system. Somewhere down the line, you are going to be a hero to not only, yourself and your family, but 4 or 5 cruisers around you who did not plan as well as you did.
Yeah, like I mentioned, it is you're one of the most vital things that you can have on board, right? Maybe there's not a need right this second when you're planning it, but it is definitely so very nice to have on board, especially for people who are cruising all around the world. You can rely on maybe your U.S. marinas to have clean fresh water, but you can make your own fresh water, which is usually better anyway, and you can
Yes.
make that anywhere in the world. Just real quick, in terms of what is available for water makers, Spectra has newer like add-ons and things to make water makers more convenient or easier to use. Do you have any add-ons or things for Spectra water makers that you'd like to highlight?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the single most unique features that Spectra offers is something called the Z-Ion. And the Z-Ion is really just a pre-filter system that introduces silver and copper molecules into the water before it goes into the membrane. So for anybody listening to this program that has some water making familiarity, you probably know that if you need to leave your boat for any reason unexpected, life happens and you need to get on an airplane or something.
Hmm.
Most people do what I think is an interesting term, but they pickle their system. And pickling just essentially means you put the water maker system into a state of storage, right, until
Right.
you can return to the vessel. But if you do not pickle the system, within about a week, what'll start to happen is the membranes will begin to accumulate what we call biofouling.
Hmm.
And the Z-ion system doesn't kill that organic material, but what it does do is it prevents it from adhering to the membrane. And if the membranes get biofouled, that's a big area of maintenance. Means you're going to have to replace those membranes. You're going to have to do some work to the system. So having a pre-filter that not only extends the life of the system, but dramatically improves the amount of time you can be away from the boat is a
Hmm.
huge asset. So we tell you, our literature tells you that with the Z-ion system, you can leave the vessel without back flushing it for up to a month. Biofouling won't form. At both the Fort Lauderdale Boat Show this year and the Miami Boat Show, I met multiple consumers that had our Z-ion system and had to leave the vessel for months, like 2 to 3 months. But the vessel had a Z-ion system, and when they came back to the boat, they had to back flush the system several times to get rid of the musty odor. But the biofouling never accumulated on the membrane. So whether or not you're using a Spectra system, which we hope you are, you definitely should have a Z-ion system for any water maker because it's not only going to dramatically improve the life of the system, but it's also going to allow you to leave the vessel unattended for extended periods of time.
Yeah, I think it's a great add-on and it's like really simple to install. It's just you already have that filter there and you're basically adding a couple of things to that filter, sort of modifying it a little bit, very easily. It greatly reduces the amount of flushing that you have to do, and which means you'll save water in the future. You're not using too much of your freshwater flush. There's systems out there that will have automatic freshwater flushing, and it'll do it every 3, 5, 7 days, what have you, which keeps the membrane clean. But now you're using all that fresh water you made. So I think the Z-Ion is a great add-on. Really quickly, what other things does Spectra have in terms of like ease of use, like electronic wise, automatic features, things like that?
Sure, yeah. Well, you can choose your display configuration with Spectra. You can have a simple analog display,
Hmm.
start, stop, flush. You could have a remote manual display where that display was up at the helm, so you didn't have to go down and actually engage with the water maker if you're underway. And then we also have what's called the Connect system, and the Connect system is a full digital system. It's also supported through a browser app. And as you mentioned, with that system, you can set up for auto flushes. You can manipulate the system remotely. You essentially can keep tabs on all elements of the system from a digital platform, if you will, versus just a traditional start stop flush.
For Spectra Watermakers, they are absolutely easy to install because you can mount these things upside down, vertical, in a closet. And as you mentioned earlier, they're really quiet. In terms of Spectra, what makes a good installation?
Yeah, another great question. Really, this is an area to be thoughtful about as well. I mean, you just mentioned that all of our systems are modular versus, being housed in a static container of
Hmm.
which you have to find a certain amount of room for. So you're
Hmm.
right, you can orientate them in any position. You can break the systems up into the different pieces and parts. Really, the couple things that I like to think about first and foremost is ease of access. And, that's one that I think tends to get overlooked. But the easier the system is to access it, the more you're going to pay attention to it. And by paying attention, I mean not only the filter conditions, but physically examining the system, for any leaks or anything like that. So on my boat, I like to have a very accessible system that's easy to work on. I also like to be mindful of the placement of the components as it relates to the plumbing and the electrical elements. And so,
Hmm.
what I mean by that is we talked about needing basically seawater, pumps, and membranes to make fresh water. But in
Hmm.
between that seawater and that fresh water, there's a lot of hose, there's a lot of hose clamps, there's a lot of connections and fittings. And so, what I've seen in a number of instances are systems that were self-installed, and there wasn't much attention paid to placing the plumbing components above or around the electrical components. And for anybody that spent time on a boat, eventually, a seacock's going to fail, a hose clamp's
Hmm.
going to let go, and you don't want the electrical components of your system being sprayed or even dripped on until such time as you discover that. So, keeping the system as accessible as possible and, keeping let's call it the water components insulated from the electrical components are all things that are going to pay dividends down the road.
Yeah, those are great points. What else do you think about like maybe mounting the components below the water line, how to place the inlet valve and the outlet valve? What does Spectra recommend for those kinds of things?
Yeah, for sure. There's only a couple of really absolutes, but you just touched on a few that we should talk about. It's a good idea to keep the pumps below the water line. It's also a really good idea to have a dedicated through hole or Seacock
Hmm.
for the Watermaker. There are instances where Seacocks will be shared, but you really need to be deliberate about that. And I would recommend having, professional interface to determine if your Seacock is appropriate for that. At the end of the day, you mentioned earlier the need for a freshwater flush. If you're not getting enough water through the system, it'll tend to want to draw water from other places. So dedicated seacock. You also want that strainer facing forward. I also like to think about where that seacock is located in relationship to potential cavitation events. So
Hmm.
I've seen instances where, the dedicated through hull is way forward in the vessel. The water maker is put to use while under sail. The boat is heeling, but it's also pitching and yawing. And if that through hull comes out of the water and sucks air, that's going to create cavitations. You're going to have a lot of problems. So, making sure you're below the water line, making sure that your inlets are as close to the keel or midship as possible, again, are all things that are going to pay dividends down the road.
One thing that's not so absolute is the outlet or the discharge line. What does Spectra think about that? Can we share discharge valves with something else? Can you explain a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, you can. And, you raise a good point. I've seen a variety of, shall we say, unique and interesting
Yeah.
discharge engineering. I've seen it, discharged into sink plumbing. I've
Yeah,
seen
I've
it,
seen that.
discharged into scuppers. But, again, getting back to our accessibility, I would tell you that you should shoot for a discharge that you can visually see. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about troubleshooting a little bit later, but there are certain things that you can do to really pay attention to your system's health. One of the things that I always do on my outboard boat, it's a function of habit now, being on the water my whole life, is I am always looking for that telltale stream of water coming out my outboard. The minute I
Absolutely.
don't see it, I know that there's a problem, and I better pay attention or I'm going to burn up a motor. That outlet is equally as important as on an outboard. So if your discharge is someplace where you can see it, the water maker's on, a quick look over the side is going to confirm for you whether or not you are discharging that brine, and therefore whether or not you're probably making good quality water.
Yeah, that is having that visual marker or the visual of the water going out overboard is great because I do have some people asking if they can mount that below the water line. But we typically are aligned here at Seatech Daily Watermakers, aligned with those same ideas. Is the inlet, you want that in a certain place, midship, down low as possible, zero cavitation as possible. And the discharge one, we want to see that going overboard. And I think that those points are excellent, excellent points to make. Earlier, you mentioned how you want to have easy access to your components. What are the main components that you need to access for Spectra Watermakers? And I'll include this by saying for your standard AC water makers, the ones that are very, very common and they don't have that Clark pump. They have a very loud washer pump basically attached to a large motor, right? An AC motor. It's coupled to an AC motor. They're very loud and you have to change the oil on that pump. You can have the oil, if you don't change it or the seals go bad, you have oil going into your water or water going into your crankcase or whatnot. For Spectra Watermakers, they don't have that. They don't have the need for most of their units. They don't have the need for oil changing maintenance, right? On the Clark pump. It doesn't have oil in that Clark pump. So, what are some vital components of a Spectra Watermaker you need to be able to access?
Yeah, for sure. So, all of the pumps are going to have a couple different sets of pre-filters. They're going to have a charcoal pre-filter, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then, depending on the system, you're going to have a 5 micron and a 20 micron pre-filter, and those filters don't look dramatically different than the filters you might recognize from your home.
Right.
And those filters are really there to grab the big stuff, as we call it, right? So this is the suspended turbidity that you're going to find in any harbor, in any marina. It's oftentimes going to be organic. It may be bits and pieces of whatever's floating in the water. So, really changing those pre-filters at a regular interval is an important thing to do. For our blue water sailors that are cruising all over the world, and space is an issue on a boat, but it's not uncommon, for those sailors to have 20, 30, 50 pre-filters so that no matter where they are in the world, they can always do a filter change if those become clogged. The charcoal filter that I mentioned a moment ago, the real use for the charcoal filter is to remove any chlorine from your tank water. And that's really important because chlorine is a killer of the membranes themselves.
Hmm.
So the membranes typically are pretty hardy. If you take good care of your membranes, they should last 7, 8 years. We've seen membranes that lasted, as long as 10 years. So it's
Hmm.
not something that you should have to change regularly, but you do want to make sure that you're not introducing any chlorine into the membrane or you'll burn that membrane up. And that's really where the charcoal filter comes into play. So changing your charcoal filters on a regular basis, changing your 5 and 20 micron filters. Those are the real important elements of maintenance on a, let's call it, a weekly and a monthly basis on board.
Yeah, absolutely. And you want to make sure you use the Spectra filters. There's all sorts of filters that look the same that you can buy from Home Depot, but they're actually a little different from your Watermaker filters, and they can actually cause a little bit of biofouling. Based on the materials that they're made with. So those are for Spectra Watermakers, maintenance is very, very easy. You're talking about 3 filters, that's your weekly, monthly maintenance, and then, maybe checking for leaks or something, just regular boat system type of maintenance. So Mike, Spectra Watermakers is a worldwide brand. There's dealers all over the world. There's full service provided and very well represented, I would say. For maintenance and installation, these two big things, mainly installation, maintenance is huge as well. Service repair, right? What does a Spectra customer get when they choose to have a full service provider or dealer like ourselves, install or service or do maintenance for their water makers as opposed to maybe them doing it themselves?
Yeah, great question. We get this a lot. Folks want to know, can I install the system myself? And I would tell you that if you have reasonably good electrical skills and you've got some plumbing skills, that you can install a Spectra water maker, by yourself. It's pretty straightforward. And if you follow the install manuals and you adhere to those that handful of must-haves that we talked about earlier. But I would also tell you that you do yourself a big favor if you also work in one of our FSPs into the equation. And so what I mean by that and what you're going to get is if you are mechanically inclined and you like to do projects on your boat and you want to try a self-install, go for it. But I would also encourage you to engage with one of our full service providers to come in and help you out with the final commissioning for a couple of different reasons. The first is you're going to get a second set of eyes on your installation, and there may be something there that you missed. But you're also going to get someone who's been factory trained that's going to recognize some things that might not ordinarily be there. And depending on the system and the complexity of the system, we talked about the various configurations of displays and whatnot. The system will need to be commissioned originally. And again, you could work through that through the manual and through YouTube videos yourself, but having that Spectra Pro on board to not only walk you through your first commissioning, but show you how the system operates and how to maintain it, all the little tricks and features, if you will, that might not be readily discernible from the manual. I think is really invaluable. And last but not least, having an authorized tech like yourself go through that final commissioning gets you an extended warranty. So you do it yourself, you're competent, that's great, but there's going to be one warranty period. If one of our authorized factory techs has gone over the install, has helped you commission it the first time and signs off on it, you get the extended warranty, which is a big benefit.
That is a huge benefit. And just to add on to, I can only speak for us as the full service provider, Seatech Daily Watermakers, but we're pretty flexible with, people on how they want to do installation. Some people just want us to install the whole thing, which is great. We've also had situations where we will go down to the boat and pick places where to put things, and that's really it's actually kind of hard. You need some experience sometimes figure out where to place these components in boats that are limited on space. That's one of the things that we offer is we'll go down to the boat and say this is where we'll place the Clark pump or the filters. Like Mike said, if you wanted to do most of the work of installing the components, that's totally fine with us, and then we'll come out and help you commission it, make sure everything is nice and tidy and perfect before we turn it on and the water is not going where it's supposed to, right? So
That's
we
right.
def
Yeah.
we're definitely flexible on that, and I would assume maybe some other dealers are too. So there's a little bit of leeway. So you're definitely welcome to install it yourself. That's totally fine. It's not super hard to do, like Mike mentioned. It's straightforward. You follow the steps, and now you have a working water maker. I would agree with you on maybe just at least the commissioning part. That's very vital. I totally agree. And the extended warranty is good to know. I don't think most people know that. And that's extremely valuable.
Yeah, for sure. And I appreciate you bringing us back to layout because you're right. We talked a little bit earlier around, plumbing being above electric and that fine eye for layout on the onset could really go a long way versus having the whole thing installed and then realized, shoot, I put my filter hose clamps, directly on top of my control board, which may or may not get leaked on at some point. So all really good points. Thank you.
Okay, Mike. So let's say you have your water maker and it's running beautifully. You're making fresh water, drinking water. It tastes great. Now, let's say you're either at the dock or cruising underway. What sort of items do you think that the Spectra owner should have on board?
Yeah, so it's a good idea to take some supplies with you. You don't need a mountain of stuff, but in my toolkit, I definitely have some key spares, like any system. And I would tell you in general, our systems that work the best and are the most reliable and get the most years of service are the ones that are run regularly. I think, and this will probably resonate with other systems on the boat. I meet a lot of people that have, let's say, big center consoles these days, and the center console comes with a generator, but they've owned the boat for 5 years and the generator's not been turned on once. And now it's time to use the generator, and what happens, right? There's probably going to be problems. So first and foremost, I would tell you, while you're cruising, use your water maker on a regular basis. Although it's a simple system to install and maintain, it is a critical system, and I think sometimes it tends to get neglected. None of us would install a new motor in our boat and head off to Baja without putting 40 or 50 hours on that motor. I think most people would consider that kind of foolhardy, right? But it happens all the time with water makers. So, you've done your layout, you've installed your water maker. First and foremost, use it. Even if you don't need the water, I don't care if you're discharging the water overboard. Run it, get used to it. It's almost a living organism, if you will. So the more you use it, the more in tune you're going to be. In your toolkit, you're not going to need a ton of stuff. We talked about pre-filters. You head it down to Baja, make sure you bring plenty of pre-filters. So as those pre-filters clog, you can replace those. We make a standard, what we call a cruising kit. Not a bad idea to have one of those. Make sure you have all your wrenches to take off the filters. And I think an invaluable piece of equipment to have on board the boat is a handheld TDS meter, which
Hmm.
will measure salinity. They're like 25 bucks, super inexpensive. But if you are in a far-flung place and you begin to experience any mechanical issues, being able to get a clear reading on just, what kind of water production you're getting will really go a long way in helping us diagnose, what's going on with your system.
No worries.
Definitely bring some storage compound with you as well. We talked about
Right.
pickling earlier. So, we all have grand plans, but life happens. You get somewhere far flung, the boat's all set up, but then you get the phone call and you need to get on an airplane to go home. You want to have some storage compound on board the boat for pickling. I'm calling it storage compound. We make a powdered compound that can be used. We make it in a powder form, quite frankly, because it's small and
Hmm.
space is at a premium on a boat. But
Right.
really, you're looking for a good glycol solution that you can pickle the membrane with, walk away from it, and come back and recommission the boat once you're back on board.
Right. So basically, if you're underway, you're looking for filters, maybe O-rings for your filter housings because, sometimes they get dropped in bilges or who knows where they get lost to. The wrenches for those filter housings, because we mentioned that the m main maintenance for these is basically running it and changing filters, right? So those are your main
Yep.
priorities. You want to maybe have the storage compound, which is really just a small packet and really easy to do. And all you're doing is basically running a solution through there that will inhibit biofouling, and that way your membrane, which should last a while, doesn't go bad when you're gone for months at a time. I believe up to a year, right?
Correct. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
absolutely correct. And that's your basic cruise kit. Just one editor's footnote here, and then I'll let you move on to the next one. But the other thing that I get a lot is if you are going to go on expedition, right? So if you're going to go someplace really cool that's far away from everything, just be thoughtful and mindful of spare parts as well. Because, here in the States, we're spoiled. Most of us have pretty
Hmm.
good access to good marine supply stores. But depending on where you are in the world, that may or may not be true. So if you are going to far-flung regions of the world, you may want to consider having an extra boost pump on board, having some extra hosing and hose clamps and all the same kind of spare parts that you would bring to keep your propulsion system running no matter where you were. You might want to think about that again on an extended voyage.
So to wrap things up, I think that's pretty much what we wanted to cover for maintenance, installation, and basically knowledge for people to choose the right water makers. So you will be joining us at the San Diego International Boat Show, June 11th to June 14th. And this is an excellent, excellent opportunity to come speak with Mike and really, get to know these water makers because like I said, we'll have one on display and really understand what is all involved. Now, what kind of questions should people be asking us? Is it something we've mentioned before, or anything else that you could offer as well? What type of questions should customers be asking?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for having me at the show for sure. I'm looking
Yeah.
forward to it. It's my first time in San Diego, so I'm really looking forward to it. Come by, as you mentioned, and talk to us. I'm always interested in hearing people's stories because, the planning of the adventure a lot of times is as much fun as when you actually have the butterflies in your stomach and you're casting off. So we can help talk to you about making a thoughtful choice around your water, helping you plan the right size system, even talk a little bit about installation and layout and that kind of thing. So we enjoy meeting the consumers, and we'd love to talk to you more about your maritime adventures. But there's also going to be some good specials at the show. There are some promotions and some vehicles to get you into some of those systems at a better price with some extra accessories and all that kind of good stuff. So come by, we'll help you pick the right one. We'll talk to you about your different options, and we'll send you out the door with the best deal possible.
So at the boat show, we will have extra discounts for you guys. Make sure we get the water maker for you, the one that you want, and it'll only be at the boat show. That's the deal that Spectra hands off to us, and we're basically passing it off to you. We want to make sure that you get the best price, and that happens at the boat show. So June 11th to June 14th at the San Diego International Boat Show, Safe Harbor Marina, and you'll get to meet Mike, and both Mikes, I guess. So
Clear pump on board too. So
yeah.
we talked a little bit about the Clark pump earlier, and definitely one of the biggest attractions at the shows are we have one of our systems that's made out of plexiglass. It's It's essentially clear.
Yep.
So some of the stuff that we've been talking about and mentioning throughout the day will be on display, but you'll be able to see it in a clear format so we can show you exactly what's going on with the internals, and the kids always love it.
Yeah, they do. They do. And I love it too. It's so neat to see all the little internal seals or all the little pistons inside the Clark pump. And the I believe the membrane is kind of cut in half because it's really hard to describe what a membrane is made out of because it just looks like a cylindrical fiberglass maybe object. But if it's cut, you can actually see all the layers that the water passes through where you get the fresh water into the inner tube there. In my opinion, I think that you went over all the questions that someone should have ready when they come to the boat show, right? When they come see us. What type of boat do you have? What size are your tanks? What is your average use going to be, right? Is there anything else that you think people should have ready for questions?
No, just come with your best sailing story, and I think we've covered a lot about it, everything you're going to need to know. But we look
Yep.
forward to seeing you at the show. Do we know our booth number?
We do. The booth number will be B19, B20. We got the double wide this time. We wanted to really showcase the Watermakers, so we'll definitely have a lot of space for whoever wants to come join us.
Great. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing you, and I hope we see some of our viewers today and see you in San Diego.
Yeah, looking forward to meeting you boaters. I appreciate you guys joining us today. I'm Mike with Seatech Marine Products Daily Watermakers, and this is Mike with Spectra Watermakers Katadine, and we'll see you guys at the boat show.